Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool junk to talk about today. Alright, so yesterday we had discussed the issues of salutary neglect, how England had left everybody alone. Then the French and Indian War happened, and England started to actually enforce some laws, and it made the colonies squirrely. So we're going to start talking today more tensions that are going to arise in the colonies that are going to push the colonies closer to this idea of war. Again, England is the most powerful country on earth. The colonies have a militia, maybe. So this is not a very fair fight if tensions get that high. But we're going to start talking about today of why tensions got that high. So yesterday we had talked about the Proclamation of 1763. So as far as the years go, and we'll kind of start methodically going through the years, memorizing the years isn't nearly as important as understanding the progression of what came first and then next, the idea of cause and effect, to understand how the emotions built over time. 1776, that is going to be the signing of the Declaration of Independence, so that's the big year. As you get closer to 1776, tensions are obviously going to be higher as you get up closer to that. So yesterday we started at 1763. That was the first time England had done anything that they were willing to enforce over here. They're adding new rules on the colonists, and the colonists are very rebellious people. Not a big fan of it. Just said you can't go across the Appalachian Mountains. And the colonies weren't happy about it. Then England is going to start applying these taxes to the colonies in order to pay for that French and Indian War, in which England feels like they saved the colonies from French control, and that the colonies should be very thankful for that and gladly pay these extra taxes. Now, today we're going to start talking about these taxes that start getting levied onto the colonies and how the colonies are super upset about it. Here's the theme that you have to understand as we go through and talk about these taxes. It was never about the money. It's not about the money. The colonies aren't here to be super rich. And the taxes aren't crazy high compared to other places in the world and other situations. But every tax is disrespectful to the colonists. The colonists like to be able to control themselves. They have no representation in England, in the Parliament in England, over these taxes. It's just King George saying it. Poof, here you go. If you lived in England, you would have some say-so over your own taxes. But as the colonists, they don't. Because of that, there's going to be extra hostility towards these taxes, and every single tax that comes out is deemed disrespectful to the colonists. So the colonists are going to try to fight against these in every possible way they can, passive-aggressively, and England's going to get frustrated and then try to, they start playing this game of these taxes, try to avoid it, and new taxes. And tensions are just going to rise over the next 12 years, from 1763 to 1776, in large part because of these taxes that the colonists feel are disrespectful to them. All right, so let me put myself here in the corner. Boop, 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 boop. We're going to be here in 1764. So Proclamation 1763 is the first thing that kind of eliminated the idea of salutary neglect, since England's making laws and now have troops over here willing to enforce them. So in 1764, the first taxes come out. You're going to have the Sugar Act. So the colonists, when these taxes come out, if it's a tax on something you can do without, the colonists will just refuse to buy it. It's not really like they can buy it from somewhere else, because you have to buy it from England because of the Navigation Acts. So the Sugar Act, they're going to put a tax on sugar. It just really angers the colonists because, again, the colonists have no say-so over it. England then passes something else called the Currency Act. They want to make sure that the colonists don't try to get squirrely with it and randomly print our own money, which we hadn't been doing in large part, that all these taxes have to be paid with English money. Basically the money that we were already using. Because they didn't want us to make monopoly money and try to pay these taxes with that. This is going to really anger the colonists. Again, it's not because of the actual law themselves, it's the principle behind it. The fact that we're being disrespected by having to pay a tax that we have no say-so for. Our motto is no taxation without representation. That becomes a rallying cry here. Give us a reason to fight, metaphorically, we're not ready to start shooting people yet, but the colonists are very rebellious and we're very stubborn. And we absolutely find every one of these taxes as a straight disrespectful act. This ends up being, as we started talking about the "don't tread on me" snake yesterday, it starts becoming popular. This ends up being a picture that gets put in the newspaper, and it really catches on. Same idea of the snake, but like the New England colonies, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, I guess that's Rhode Island, these are different parts of the snake. The only way the colonies are going to be able to fight against these taxes is if they come together. If they don't join together and make a snake, they're going to die. Any break here kills the snake. So while the taxes frustrated the colonies, understand these colonies are like almost independent little countries as far as they viewed each other. They traded and stuff with each other, but they were relatively unique among themselves. When they have a common enemy, which is the disrespect of these taxes, this is a very unifying thing among these 13 colonies where they start feeling like a unified group. And this is what this snake represents, and it's the join or die. Like the colonies have to work together in unison against these taxes or we're going to lose. So while the colonies were individual, these taxes and this disrespect is actually going to help unite and push them together to make them feel as one united group. So question is, why were the colonists so angry over a sugar tax and the currency tax? What were these taxes supposed to be used for? So we talked about this first part here. Explain why they're angry over it. All right, and hint, it's not because the price of sugar went up. It wasn't a fiscal or a financial reason for their anger, but the taxes. If you remember from yesterday, why is England taxing them? England needs money because they're in debt, because they just fought the 7 Years' War that in America, the colonies over here were called America. We viewed it as, our version of it was the French and Indian War, was the part of the 7 Years' War that we experienced. England has to pay for that, and they think the colonies should have to pay for it since they were defending the colonies over here, and we should be super thankful that they bailed us out. So, 1764, we're super squirrely over the Sugar Act. And then, like, they just start coming up with just random taxes. Like the Stamp Act. The colonists really tried to just boycott anything that they put a tax on. Like, fine, we won't buy it. If you don't buy it, you don't have to pay a tax on it. So, England creates the Stamp Act. So they start getting, like, all right, we'll play this game. So they create the Stamp Act. Anything that you buy that is paper has to have a stamp on it. All right. If it doesn't have a stamp on it, then you get in big trouble. Like a newspaper. You try to buy a newspaper, and I'll just make up some numbers here. Say a newspaper costs 25 cents. Well, once you buy that newspaper for 25 cents, you then have to buy a stamp that goes on that newspaper for an additional 1 or 2 cents. All right. And the paper isn't valid unless you get that stamp on the paper. And it's probably a percentage of the cost. So if you buy land and you get a land deed, all right, you have to have a stamp on it. You buy a newspaper, has to have a stamp on it. You need to get something notarized, has to have a stamp on it. You sign a contract for work, has to have a stamp on it. So you have to have paper in society in order to function. You can't boycott paper, all right? So England knows this, so they make the Stamp Act. So every time you buy something that's on paper, you have to pay an extra amount for this stamp. All right. This is the actual stamp of what it looked like that would go on the paper. I don't know if they would glue it on or staple it on. But here, this is actually zoomed in on of a newspaper. So in the bottom right corner, I mean, it says right here, like, this is the place to affix the stamp. If you see the skull and crossbones, that means you don't have a stamp on it, and means you can be in a whole bunch of trouble. So when you buy the newspaper, then you have to buy the stamp as well to go over the top of this so that you have paid your taxes. And I like that there's a lot of versions of this, but you can see, like, this is just a newspaper here, and it's just in the bottom right corner. You had to have the stamp. Shocker, the colonists hate it. Why? Same reason they hated the sugar tax, the same way they hated the currency tax, same way they hate the Stamp Act. Is it because the stamp? Is it like, oh, we're not stamp people here? That's not what it is. It's disrespectful. We're being treated differently than people in England. People in England don't have to pay a stamp act. All right, they don't have to buy a stamp for everything that they have. America feels like, I keep saying America, the colonists feel like they're being treated as an inferior group to the other citizens in England. So in theory, they're supposed to be equal, but they're being treated as an inferior group because of where they live. And the colonists, not a big fan of that. So there's a lot of hostility against these taxes because it's disrespectful, not financial. Can't stress that enough. So what is the Stamp Act and why did the colonists dislike it so much? Make sure you answer these in 2 sentences. It's pretty straightforward. And you can pause me and I'll move on. All right. So Boston. So Boston is in Massachusetts. If you remember, this is where the Puritans are going to land. Because it's a deep water port and has been there longer. So yes, New York City exists and New York City is growing. Boston is the biggest city in America. Of the 13 colonies, Boston by far the biggest city. So a lot of stuff takes place in Boston. Boston is kind of the epicenter of rebellion against these taxes because it's the biggest port. Almost everything that comes from England, I say almost, a lot of stuff that comes from England comes through Boston. All right, so it's the biggest city here. So not surprising, a lot of the drama that we're going to talk about that's going to lead up to the Revolutionary War is going to take place in Boston. All right. So the people that live in Boston are called the Bostonians. And here's a few very, very famous ones. And this is cool. You'll like these stories. All right. So James Otis, this guy right here. James Otis is a really, really good lawyer. All right. So what James Otis would do is if you're a rich guy and you got in a bunch of trouble for doing something and you went to court, you would hire the absolute best lawyer around. That's James Otis. He'd come and charge you $1 gazillion and get you off of whatever charge that you're on. All right. So James Otis is very famous, very good lawyer. Well, in his free time, he just screwed with England. So in his free time, he hangs out at the courthouse and waits to see people that show up that have somehow been wronged by the British government. These are usually poor people, all right? And they're going to show up, but they can't afford a lawyer, so they're going to get railroaded. They're going to be thrown in jail or whatever. So James Otis, for the fun of it, hangs out and will defend these people for free. So when they show up and they go into court, James Otis is like, I got it. And he just talks circles around the British, whatever they're accusing this guy of, and he always gets these guys off. All right, so just for fun, he just hangs out and frustrates the British because he's such a good lawyer, just gets all these people off that otherwise would have been thrown in jail. The British are, so he becomes famous for just standing up to the British all the time in their court system. James Otis ends up getting jumped after one of these court meetings in the street by some British soldiers and beaten to within like an inch of his life. He doesn't die, but he's never able to practice law again. They beat the living bejesus out of him in the street. So this is the first time you're starting to see like some violence creep out and the frustration from both sides. And this is James Otis right here. All right. Then there's this guy here, Sam Adams. All right. Samuel Adams. So Samuel Adams would be described as a rabble-rouser, all right? He's the guy in the back screaming, bet you won't hit him, all right? So Samuel Adams, he's like a community organizer. If there's going to be a protest, Samuel Adams not only is going to be there, he probably organized it. Absolutely outspoken critic of the British. Absolutely disliked him. So whenever the British do anything, he's going to bring it out. He's going to be like, we can't stand for this. He'll have the protests. He'll have the marches. He'll be the biggest trash talker. He does not want to have anything to do with the British government. He's kind of, in his time, he is relatively extreme. All right. He is the leader of this movement against the British having anything to do in your life and all that. Now, he has a cousin named John Adams. All right. So John Adams, and I'm going to clarify both of these guys in detail. John Adams here, absolute genius lawyer, right? Really boring guy, but a genius lawyer. John Adams will eventually, he'll end up being George Washington's vice president. He will end up being the second president of the United States. But at this time, the most famous one of the is Samuel. Everybody in Boston knew Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams shows up, something's going to happen. Like you're going to party, you're going to do something, and then they're going to, something weird's going to happen. Like he would be riffraff, I guess you would say. I'm sure the British called him a thug. 100% chance they called him a thug. That even though he's all dressed nice here, he's going to show up and motivate a mob to go tear something down. That is the type of person Samuel Adams is. So they have another family member, all right, at this time period, who is starting to create a beer company, all right? Samuel Adams is very famous at this time for standing up to the British. So when they have a family member who is creating a beer company, they say, hey, and they go to Sam Adams, not John Adams, and they ask Sam Adams, can they name their beer after you, all right, and call it Sam Adams. Sam Adams is cool with it. Sam Adams does not own his beer company, but Sam Adams is aware they're using his name to sell beer and is cool with it. The reason the beer today, it's a Sam Adams beer still around today, it's called Sam Adams and not John Adams, is because when the beer company came out, Sam Adams is much more famous than John Adams, all right? And we're going to talk about these two guys more in detail, but they're both in Boston. They don't necessarily get along. John Adams thinks, we should take the legal recourse, we should go through all the legal stuff, and Sam Adams is like, no, they're treating us awful. We're going to do action. We're going to go, set something on fire to show them that we mean business. And John Adams is like, well, we can fill out the right paperwork. So John Adams, while absolutely a genius, very much so is not the man of action that Sam Adams is. So at the time in Boston, if you were against the British, you loved Sam Adams, and the British absolutely hated him. Then there's a guy named Paul Revere. All right, so Paul Revere, and we're going to talk about him more, is famous for a few things. Well, the ride through, the British are coming, which, so as we get there, when the British show up with their army closer to when it's fighting time, at Lexington and Concord, he famously rides through and warns everybody that the British are coming, which clearly he didn't say, because guess what everybody is British. All right, I can say it now and you know what I mean. There's the British and the colonists, but the colonists technically are British. So it'd be like somebody riding through town saying, the Americans are coming, like today. It wouldn't make any sense. So the famous line of him saying the British are coming, he's probably saying the Redcoats are coming, which is the army is coming. Paul Revere, also extremely famous in Boston for his rendition and his drawing after the Boston Massacre that we haven't yet got to. But Paul Revere, we'll mention him a couple more times. So while he is very famous and he's a Bostonian, he's got standalone stories I want to talk about here soon. So what do all of these men have in common? All right. Well, they all live in Boston. And who are they all pretty much against? Is the British. Now, John Adams will eventually be very against the British, but go with me on that one. They are part of this growing idea in Boston that it's them versus us. Like, there is this divide that the British aren't here to help us out. They're like a negative influence, almost like an invading force in our society. So that's what the question here is. Answer that in 2 complete sentences. Pause me as always if you need. All right. So now we're up to 1767, all right? 9 years away from 1776, all right, where the Declaration of Independence gets signed. So there is a bunch of taxes. England gets more frustrated, and they're going to pass a collection of taxes called the Townshend Acts, all right? It's called the Townshend Revenue Act. So Charles Townshend, he comes out and he puts this tax on a whole bunch of stuff: paper, paint, lead, glass, alcohol, tea, all of this stuff that gets imported into the colonies. All right, there's an extra tax on. Once again, is the tax outlandish? No. But when you tax things, it is viewed as extremely disrespectful to the colonists, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. One of the other things that the Townshend Act does is it's going to pay the governors. So here's what was happening. England had been appointing a governor. All right, we had talked about Cosby. earlier with a couple days ago with the trial of John Peter Zenger. So there's a governor appointed by the English, but the English just appointed a governor and then went over here and said, hey, you tax people and then you just collect the tax money and pay yourself. So England had nothing to do with paying taxes, all right, or paying the governors over here. So most of the governors that came over here, while they're representing the evil, England, most people, most of the time, like their governor. And here's why. Because the governor treated the people well. Because who pays the governor's salary is the actual people over here. He has to tax them and he gets paid from them, from the colonists. So he's usually on the side of the colonists because they're the ones who pay his paycheck. The Townshend Act eliminates that and say, no, 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 no. From now on, England is going to pay the salary of the governors so that the governors will then enforce the rules of England in the colonies. This is very effective for England's side, where they are saying, absolutely, we are going to, the governors absolutely start enforcing all the laws that they used to just turn a blind eye to, like smuggling and stuff like that. But it's going to raise tensions because now England is bearing down and actually enforcing all these laws that had been on the books that the governors had always ignored until now. Since they actually work for England and not the colonists, the governors are going to start enforcing these laws that hadn't been enforced in a really long time. So the Townshend Act puts a tax on tea. And there is stories with the taxes on tea. Let me explain tea. In the South, everybody's like, sweet tea? Like at Bojangles? No, not what they're talking about for tea. It is not cold sweet tea. It is like coffee, like hot tea, like sipping out of a cup. It is very much a British cultural thing. It's like a way of life. I don't really have a good, maybe like how connected people are to their cell phones. Maybe it is a little different. I don't know exactly what you would correlate in modern society to the need for tea, but it is very much like a part of your culture of who you are is the tea, right, and drinking tea. So the tax on tea is going to get people squirrely because is the tax on tea necessary? Is tea necessary? No, but everybody really wants it, and it's kind of a jerk move to put a tax on the tea. They're eventually going to make the law even more bullcrap and causes some additional drama. But the Townshend Acts were a whole bunch of different taxes put on the colonists, basically to be able to pay their own governors so that the governors will continue to enforce the laws and kind of put the colonies on lockdown. Colonies don't like being on lockdown because the colonists are extremely rebellious people. All right? And the more rules you put on them, the more pushback you're going to get. So this is clearly a kid's drawing. It says, boycott the Townshend Acts. Because the Townshend Acts, people were very unhappy with them. All right, so the question here is, what were the Townshend Acts? So go through, explain that in a couple sentences. Explain how it affected the governor's pay as well, because that's a big part of the Townshend Acts. What they affected, how they were taxed and what they taxed and things like that. So pause me if you need to, but write 2 complete sentences there. All right. 1770. Man, it starts to get crazy. So between 1768 and 1770, after the Townshend Act, there ends up being a lot of people who are unhappy with these taxes. There's actual guys that like travel around, the tax collectors. They'd start getting beat up and tarred and feathered. There'd be awful things that would happen to them. And Britain was furious about this. So Britain started sending soldiers over to Boston. So these are British soldiers wearing red outfits, the red coats, their official uniform. Now keep in mind, these are British citizens that live over here in the colonies. So it's like your own army coming over to keep the peace in your own town. However, the soldiers are baffled when they show up, and the soldiers are treated almost from the beginning as like an invading force. Like nobody wants to talk to them, like they're like, oh, why are you here? And the soldiers are like, well, I'm your army. Like, you're supposed to be happy I'm here. I'm here to protect you from crazy stuff. But that's not how the colonies view it. They do feel like that these soldiers are here to tell them what they can or can't do, and there is hostility in Boston. So what does England do? Send more troops. So from 1768 to 1770, for 2 years, England just starts sending more and more troops into Boston to keep it from getting crazy. But it just makes more tension. Sam Adams is talking all this trash. There's, a bunch of little drama things are happening. So, what happens on March 5th, 1770, really is going to change the outcome and the direction on Earth. So, on March 5th, 1770, there's a group of soldiers, right? There's about 5 of them. Redcoats. They're patrolling. There's still snow on the ground. It's Boston. It's further north. Even though it's March, it's not springtime. There's still snow. That they are out, and the bars close, and a bunch of drunk people leaving the bars see the soldiers and just start trash talking them. All right? They just start trash talking. And so these soldiers are like 17 years old. All right? They're not some grizzled veterans or whatever. They're younger. So they're from England. They're over here. They're just doing their patrol. And a group of drunk guys start harassing them, talking trash to them. All right. And the crowd gets bigger. And they start throwing snowballs at the soldiers, which you probably shouldn't do. These are the most elite fighting force on Earth at the time. But so they start throwing snowballs and talking trash to them. Well, the soldiers start getting a little nervous because, they're clearly outnumbered here. Like, nobody's really done a crime, but they're clearly outnumbered. So what they do is they call for backup. They see, like down the alley, they see there's other redcoats that they call for backup. So when they call for backup, the crowd's like, oh, you need backup! And it gets really uncomfortable. Like, everybody starts talking trash. It starts talking trash. And then the soldiers open fire into the crowd. All right. When the soldiers open fire into the crowd, it kills 5 people. All right. And the whole crowd disperses. All right. Now, there's a whole big debate for a long time of what happened. We have a pretty good idea of what actually transpired. It was a mistake. 100% a mistake. So, to give you a rundown of what happened, so I don't vilify anybody here, I want to give you it as accurate as possible. The colonists who are not armed, means, yeah, they have like clubs and stuff, but they don't have guns. And the redcoats clearly do. So when they call in the backup guys that show up, they have like a commander with them who goes out and stands in front of, the soldiers, all right, between the soldiers and an angry mob. The angry mob, because now the soldiers have pointed their guns at them, just like to keep them away. So the angry mob is taunting them, screaming, fire, fire, fire. Like, shoot it. Like go ahead, do it. Bet you won't, because this is what drunk people do in the middle of the night. Like, because that's idiots, like to taunt people to shoot you. So the commanding officer, who is standing in front, screams, don't fire, don't fire. The crowd gets louder. One of the soldiers gets hit with a club and gets knocked down. All right. Sometime between him falling and getting back up, and the commanding officer scream at his own soldiers, don't fire. They hear fire. That somebody, so the soldiers open fire eventually. I don't believe anybody was in cold blood like, I'm going to murder you, any of the soldiers. But regardless of the situation, it had gotten out of control. The soldiers open fire and they kill 5 colonists, and everybody else scatters. All right. This is not good. Like, the soldiers just open fire on unarmed colonists. All right. Regardless of how you look at it, on did they deserve it, were they taunting them or whatever, you can't do that. All right. You just can't. So the soldiers go back. The next day, and the reason this becomes so famous is because of Paul Revere, one of those Bostonians that we had already mentioned. The reason this becomes so famous is 5 guys got killed in a skirmish. I guess you'd call it a skirmish. It's kind of a one-way skirmish with the British soldiers, is because of this picture. So that night, Paul Revere, who he was not there, but he saw this immediately. He was like right nearby when this has happened. He goes and he carves this picture in, all right, with a car, and then prints it because it puts ink on it, puts it on the newspaper. The next day, this picture gets printed in every newspaper in Boston. Then it's going to spread along all 13 colonies. This picture, along with his name of this incident, Paul Revere calls this the Boston Massacre. That's extremely, he calls it a massacre. He coined that term. That idea, along with this picture, like look at their faces. They're like smiling, and the commanding officer standing behind, ordering them to fire. All right, when in actuality, the commanding officer was up here in the front telling them not to. Like it was a mistake that it happened, but it doesn't matter what really happened. You know what people believe happened? This picture, power of the media. All right, that according to this picture, the redcoats stood in a line. Their commanding officer back here with smiles on their face fired into a crowd of these people like they're going to Sunday school. Look, you got a puppy here shooting people in the head. Everybody's just crying, oh no, I'm just trying to go about my life. This type of reporting is really going to change the dynamic in the United States, in the colonies at the time. When this picture and the story that he puts with it circulates the colonies, who's the bad guy? The bad guy is now going to be the redcoats, and it is going to be a fundamental shift in the colonies. Now it is this mentality of us versus them. Not hey, this is an internal dispute among British people. It is, there's us, the colonists, and them, the British. All right? The Boston Massacre, especially with this drawing, because not everybody could read and write, but you can see a picture. All right? This picture carved by Paul Revere, all right, that gets put in every newspaper is going to fundamentally change the view of the British and the further outcome in the tensions between the two. All right, so we're still 1770, 6 years away from the Declaration of Independence. But the question here is, what was the Boston Massacre and how did the colonists react to the Boston Massacre? All right. So pause me here if you need. Get 2 sentences here, and we're going to move on. All right, 1772. All right, we're 4 years from the Declaration of Independence. They have built up on this idea of us versus them. Now, the colonists have no military, right? Because the military is the redcoats. So you can't really... The problem is the colonies view the redcoats as an invading army. There ends up being something that gets created called the Committees of Correspondence. This is really unique. When I explain it to you, it may not seem like it's that big of an idea, but it is. This is huge. The people involved in this are treasonous to England. So there's these big cities, Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Norfolk, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina. They're going to create something called a Committees of Correspondence. These are secret groups inside each one of these major cities. Because keep in mind, there's no telephone, or the mail basically gets regulated here by the British. These colonies need to unite, like that snake. That needs to come together and connect. All right? They are going to all start spying on the soldiers in their city. And they are secretly going to interact with the other, all 13 colonies are going to interact with each other so that they know what's happening in all the other colonies. So they are spying technically on their own army. That's pretty shady if you think about it, if you're somebody that supports England. And people are starting to pick a side in the colonies. There are a lot of people who still support England. They're like, I don't know why these, rabble-rousers are trying to challenge the king. We have it pretty good. If you support England continuing to own the colonies, you would be referred to as a loyalist. If you are somebody who starts thinking the colonies should do their own thing and be independent, you're called a patriot. So these committees of correspondence, which are treasonous, which means they're spying on their own government and basically trying to figure out where the troop movements are and as much information as they can get over what Britain is doing here. Those type of people are patriots, and they create their own communication system called the Committee of Correspondence, which is the first united action of all 13 colonies and a cohesive group against the British, and that's why the committees of correspondence are so important. But you got to be careful because there's loyalists around. I mean, you got snitches. So you're doing this thing that can get you executed for spying on your own army, and like it's pretty shady if you look at it from that perspective of spying on your own army, that you have a whole bunch of snitches around that'll tattle on you and get you executed real quick. So being a patriot was not something to be taken lightly. And patriots, you only got about 20% of the population that's a patriot at the time. You got about 20% that's loyalist. And about 60% that don't give a crap. They just don't. They're like, who cares whether I give my stuff to England, whether we're our own country, whether France takes us over? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to farm tobacco. So a lot of people just don't care at this time. Even after the Boston Massacre. You have people in the corners that care a whole lot, like people in Boston. But a lot of people just don't care and won't pick a side. So this is a sign that says, "We love King George." This would be a loyalist. This kid's having one with an X through a crown, so he'd be a patriot. He doesn't want to be controlled by England anymore. So the question here is, why was the committees of correspondence so important for the colonists? Specifically, what did it represent? So we had talked about that in detail. So go through there, get that in 2 sentences, and that is it for this video lesson today. See you guys tomorrow.